Energy Matters podcast. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I am your host Qasim Alokla from Texas A&M University Society of Petroleum Engineers Student Chapter, TAMO SPE. The aim of this podcast is to discuss and explore some specific topics about the energy industry in general and the oil and gas in specific, while covering some related topics in environment, economics, policy, and many more. Howdy and welcome to another episode of the Energy Matters podcast. I'm Qasim, your host of today's episode on Oxy's approach to revolutionizing emissions reduction with our special guest, Dr. Rob Zeller. We are recording this podcast from Oxy's office in Houston. Thank you for agreeing to be on our podcast, Dr. Zeller.
My pleasure.
Thanks. All right, before kicking off, let me introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Robert Zeller is the Vice President of Technology for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures and serves as a board member and Vice President for Terra Lithium. He has 35 years of experience in the chemical industry, is a recognized leader in operational excellence, and has successfully scaled technologies for the test tube to commercial scale several times in his career. Applying that knowledge and skill to CCUS, lithium, and associated technologies in his mission with low-carbon solutions at Oxy. Dr. Zeller holds 20 U.S. patents, has made numerous presentations to professional groups, and is a registered professional engineer in Texas. Dr. Zeller has received multiple awards and honors for his contributions. In 2022, Dr. Zeller was awarded the prestigious Winthrop Sears Medal, which recognizes exceptional innovations and entrepreneurship in the sciences field for his pioneering innovative low-carbon technologies and business solutions that reduces emissions. In 2017, Dr. Zeller was awarded the IKE Management Division Award, which recognizes an outstanding individual who has made a substantial contribution to the management and leadership of engineers and scientists involved in the field of chemical engineering, specifically for his leadership and innovation in operational excellence. Dr. Zeller earned his PhD in chemical engineering from Case Western Reserve University and received his master's and bachelor degree in chemical engineering from the University of Akron. Wow, that's amazing. All right. So before we get started, I want to ask you the first question that we usually ask for our guest speakers. Why do you think energy matters?
Energy matters is the foundation of everything that we do in society. Part of the reason that oil and gas has unleashed progress and brought people out of poverty is because of low-cost energy that we have. So that's why energy matters.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So let's start now with the questions and specifically shed light on your education and early career. First of all, we are eager to dive into your academic journey, tracing the path from your undergraduate education to securing your master's and PhD degrees in chemical engineering. Please enlighten us on how your education has shaped your career, especially in steering you towards emphasis on low-carbon solutions, especially carbon capture and storage.
Sure. Thank you for that, Qasim. And you can call me Rob if you'd like. It's
okay.
Up to you. So, I'll be honest, coming out of high school, I was, really a first generational person to go to college and working towards a degree. So I'll admit my freshman year, I was not a great student. I had a little bit too much fun, as some people have, but I was able to turn it around. And I will say that every semester from that freshman year, my GPA went up. When I graduated, and I should say also as part of my experience in undergraduate at University of Akron, I participated in the cooperative education program, which is sort of like an internship, except it's a full semester that you take off and do work. And so I did that for, so I got a full year of cooperative education.
Okay.
But when I graduated, and I'll give you my date that I graduated in 1983.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, before you were born. It was right in the middle of a recession, and so jobs were very, very difficult. Chemical industry was under stress. Oil prices were in the tank. There really weren't a lot of jobs available, and I even tried to apply. I really had an interest to become a graduate student and further my education. But it was difficult. All the students that couldn't find jobs stayed home, and so I couldn't go to Colorado School of Mines, or I couldn't go blank and blank and blank. And so I ended up, just by happenstance, at a job placement office there at University of Akron, met an old professor, and he said, "Hey, I got a teaching assistantship. You want to go towards a master's program?" And I just jumped on that. So Dr. Atwood, I appreciate him taking me on this path. So got my master's degree at University of Akron, decided at that point to pivot into a little bit different established program. I was focused on electrochemical engineering type of activities. Case Western Reserve, which you've never heard of, but it's in Cleveland, Ohio, is pretty well known and is well known for electrochemical type of activities.
Uh-huh.
So went up there, got my PhD, and that's pretty much it. As part of my undergraduate degree, I did do an EIT, engineering training, or sort of like the basic first step to get your professional engineer's license. And so that was important to keep my options open, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't really even think about low carbon ventures or carbon capture and storage for my entire career. I mean, I started off with a PhD in chemical engineering, and right out of school, I went to I went to OxyChem, Grand Island Research Center. I've spent 35 years with Oxy. I'm just celebrating in March 1st my 35th year with Oxy. I went to Oxy primarily because my wife has a PhD in chemical engineering. Okay. She got the job at Oxy, and so they didn't have a job for me for a while, but eventually they wanted her, so they got me a job, I'll put it that way. So I was sweeping floors. No, I wasn't sweeping floors. But I started doing that, and when I got there, I was doing research. I got patents. A couple of my patents turned into something special, and I went to the Niagara plant, helped pilot a technology we had there, and then ended up designing and building, was the startup coordinator and operated a technology that I had been part of. Mm-hmm. It was, since you care, bipolar electrodialysis of sodium hypophosphate to make hypophosphorus acid. It's quite a mouthful, right? But it was pretty cool. It was electrochemical, and was able to make that all work. Uh-huh. Sorry about that. So I went to the manufacturing plant, worked my way up from Western New York, went down to Houston in 2003, went to corporate headquarters and was an executive in 2008 till 2018. Mm-hmm. And I did a bunch of different things there that, it's one thing that I tell people when I think of coaching is you do what others won't. Just always raise your hand. Yes. And step out there and try to take care of it, because you never know what interactions or networking or introductions that really changes your career and your career path.
Exactly.
So, about 6 years ago, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures was formed. It was Vicki Hollov, our CEO, had seen that President Trump, as a matter of fact, signed what was called the Future Act in 2018 that expanded 45Q. Mm-hmm. Yes. And since Oxy uses and sequesters permanently about almost up to 20 million metric tons per year, the expanded 45Q with 12 years, X number of dollars per ton, was billions of dollars of potential. So our CEO, Vicki Hollov, said, well, is there a business here? So she assembled 6 of us as sort of the core founders of Low Carbon Ventures. I was the technology guy, because I was generally known as the guy that was thinking out of the box and go figure out what you want to go do. And so it's basically, you can look at technologies pretty quickly to know if they're baloney or not. Yeah. Do they break some sort of thermodynamic principle? It's a little bit harder to say, okay, here's what we do within the Oxy business, OxyChem, Oxy Oil and Gas, and applying that technology in a business way, and then pooling resources and our know-how in order to bring those to commerciality. So that's what I've been working on with regard to Low Carbon Ventures. A little bit of history there too.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Thank you for sharing this. So you mentioned, like at the beginning, of course, it was a rewarding journey, like your academic studies, but of course there might be some like hurdles during that journey. So how these challenges, mainly during your studies and early career, has played a role into your success now, like as one of the leaders in Oxy Low Carbon Ventures?
Yeah, there's always challenges that you have to pivot into making stepping stones, as you say. So, not everything. Everything is hard. Yes. Nothing is easy. Yeah. That's just, you just go into it. Nothing is given to you. Nobody cares about your career except for you.
Exactly. I agree.
So I've just celebrated my 35 years at Oxy, as I said, and it's not been 35 years doing the same thing. Yeah. It's a variety of, I started off in R&D, And then I followed one of my inventions into an Oxy chemical plant, was right across the river, where I got involved. I didn't even know how to be a startup coordinator. I didn't know the fundamentals of design in a chemical plant using highly hazardous chemicals and process safety management. So I had to learn all that type of stuff on the fly. But those are the foundational things that you need as you go into making carbon utilization, carbon capture, carbon storage, all a reality. So when I decided to go to manufacturing, one of the things that I felt was important is I had spent, as a PhD, you're really highly focused on your particular discipline. So you have a lot of deep knowledge there, but you don't have a generalist concept of chemical engineering, at least in my case.
Correct.
So I went out and studied over an entire summer and got my professional engineer's license.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that allowed me to go back, refresh the fundamentals, so that when I worked in a chemical engineering manufacturing environment, I sort of knew what I was talking about. It helped refresh me. And so getting a master's and PhD and doing R&D is great, but it's highly focused, and it generally is apart from what the real world is all about.
Yeah, I agree.
So, my view was always to work yourself out of a job, and as another career phase.
Yes.
So one thing that I always think, if you're too good at something or are too useful to the leadership, they will want to keep you where you are, as that makes their job easier.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
That happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I thought I did a good job. I was recognized as getting a good job, get raises, awards, all that type of stuff. But I was ready to do something else. I had basically could close my eyes, put my arm behind my back, and do the job. And I took a chance. I went outside of my organizational line management, went to another business unit, and said I was interested in for other opportunities. And I wouldn't recommend that approach for anybody. I mean, I basically took a chance because that if it didn't work out, it would have negatively impacted my career. Yep. But I did it, and it worked out great.
Perfect.
That's why I'm part of Low Carbon Ventures now.
That's so good. So your approach is to take initiative and also be willing to move to different segments and don't stick to.
I mean, I went from Cleveland and from my PhD and went to Western New York. So I worked at a couple of different. Western New York at one point was the center of chemical engineering. I mean, that's where hydropower was. There was a big industry that had formed back in the early 1900s, but when I got there in 1989, it was more towards the twilight of the heyday, and so I had an R&D center, did manufacturing there, and then I was willing to move. So I moved down to Houston. I was with 5 or 6 chemical plants down here as the technical leader, and really, when I moved down here, I was supposed to go down as the VCM technical manager. I didn't know how to spell VCM, which is vinyl chloride monomer. So I had to learn all that stuff, and by the time I left, I felt I was pretty competent in the technologies. I understood all the technical issues and areas that you needed to worry about. And then when I went to corporate as a leader, director of technology, it just helped me learn by understanding the real things that happen in a real plant. It helped you be a leader so you can solve the real issues that affect the real people out there.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you so much. All right, one last question in this section. You previously mentioned about when you want to coach someone, you will give them an advice to be open and always take the initiative. So we also know that mentorship often plays a pivotal, if not critical, role in shaping one's career. Could you please share some insights into how mentorship has influenced your leadership style and your approach to fostering innovation in emerging technologies within the realm of chemical engineering?
And that's a good question. I'll admit, perhaps I was oblivious in my career. I never sought out or looked for a mentor, so to speak. But in hindsight, there were certainly supervisors and managers with whom I had great respect and learned from them how to lead. Yeah. Based upon their behaviors and different styles. And as I became a leader, I then looked for exceptional talent and helped some of them maybe open doors that maybe would have eventually turned out for them. But if I found, I had the ability, or I had the privilege of doing these different, I'll call them technical assessments, where I would assemble a team of 6 people. We would go to different chemical plants. We'd do maybe 4 or 5 a year. And I could get different teams and different people from the OxyChem organization, for example, to be part of this team, and how they handled themselves and how they, at the question they asked, how they showed leadership. There was a number of them that came through that I was able to promote within the OxyChem organization, that many of them are plant managers today. Oh. And so finding the right talent, and they could have been that they would have got there anyway, but it was, I had the ability to help influence some of the really great people that are in OxyChem today. Another example about mentoring is I had a team give me a presentation on a technology that they developed, and about 6 months ahead of that, I told them there was an inherent flaw in their thought process, that it's a fatal flaw in the technology. It's not going to work. It's not going to be economic. You got to fix this. So they came back in like 6 months and then gave a presentation on exactly the same thing. They spent a lot of work, a lot of activity, but didn't achieve the fact that they didn't get to the point that they needed to get to. They still had a fundamental fatal flaw. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty hard on them. Okay. That's part of leadership too, is being frank and direct, and they went back and developed came back in 3 months later and developed a complete paradigm shift on how they approached a problem, that came up with a fantastic solution that, in my opinion, is almost like a platform technology that can be incorporated in the next generation carbon capture, for example. So they really came up with a completely out-of-the-box thought, figured it out, got it, and it's amazing what they did. So, what's my approach? Always remember, this is a business. A business needs to make money. Yeah. Money's not a bad thing. It's how you have a sustainable business. And if you want to work on climate, you want to work on utilization, you want to work on sequestration, it's all about having a sustainable business, which means that business has to have revenue. Yeah. And another thing is, always leave your ego at the door. Many times I thought I was right. It turned out to be wrong, and that's okay. I want to be wrong. Prove me wrong. And I always leave your ego at the door. We have one team with one goal. That's the benefit of working in an industry as opposed to academia. Yeah. Academia, it's all about my team, my goal. In industry, it's one team with one goal, and we all work together to solve problems and make it work. Exactly. Looking at the when I look at technology, you want to show the dirty underbelly of the technology. It's not like you want to hide the bad stuff. You want to confront the bad stuff and go figure it out and get it better. And confronting issues head on is sort of my style, and I work to instill that in others. So.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Hope that makes sense.
This is amazing. Thank you. All right. Now let's get technical.
All right.
And what's more important than carbon capture and storage to talk about? All right. I want to ask you a fundamental question, because some of our audience might not be familiar with one certain topic, which is direct air capture, which is a big part of your job right now. Maybe in 1-2 sentences, could you please define direct air capture for us?
1 or 2 sentences, quite a challenge. So when you look at CO2 in the atmosphere, it's gone from, say, 275 parts before the industrial time, 1700s or so, and it's over 420 today. All that CO2 that's been put into the environment and into the air is from the burning of fossil fuels. And there are scientific consensus that additional CO2 in the atmosphere is causing heat to be retained into the earth, that the nature just can't keep up with all that. Yeah. So what direct air capture does is it provides an assist to nature. Instead of using natural processes, it uses technology to pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere, concentrating that CO2 into what we do as a supercritical fluid, and injecting that deep underground, basically putting the carbon back where it came from. Okay. And that technology approach, that's direct air capture. Point source capture or carbon capture in general. If you have a coal-fired power plant and they're using coal to generate electricity, you can capture that CO2 out of that smokestack, condense it, put it in a supercritical fluid, and inject that deep underground. So there's no net negative impact to the release of CO2. Sure. Now, direct air capture is not a reduction, it's a removal. You actually can pull the CO2 that your grandfather released back when he was a young pup, back when he was doing whatever he was doing.
Exactly.
You can pull your grandfather's CO2 out of the air and bury it deeply. So that's what's so powerful about direct air capture.
Wow. That's so super. All right, perfect. All right, now let's talk more about like the general idea, which is carbon capture and storage, and then maybe later on we can focus on direct air capture. So in our mission to mitigate the climate change, CCUS technologies may be one, if not the most significant mechanism. So could you please elaborate on how these innovations, particularly direct air capture, not only enable oil and gas sectors to diminish their carbon footprint and better align with the current emissions reduction mandates, considering, of course, the current technological landscape, and one of the most important aspects of like carbon capture and storage, which is like the scalability. You know, we know that currently there are like some carbon capture projects, but they might not be that scalable. Some of them are pilot projects. So could you please elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I'll try. So if you look at a global net zero by 2050, it's going to require technology solutions as well as a lot of other activities, you know, to deliver large scale and rapid emissions reduction. You know, electrify everything. That's usually the low hanging fruit, but you can't electrify a jet.
Yeah.
I mean, some small little commuter craft, you can do that, but you can't go across the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. You need a different approach, and that's why direct air capture is so powerful, is that it can mitigate the release of CO2 from a jet plume, contrails, and you can actually pull CO2 in a different part because the air is a shared resource. It's generally mixed everywhere.
Yeah.
So to address the climate challenge in terms of Oxy, we built a strategy that builds upon our existing carbon management foundation. So what does that mean? So in Oxy, you may not know this, but we've been safely and responsibly handling CO2 for about 50 years.
Yeah. Due to EOR.
EOR. That doesn't, it's still, you have to handle CO2.
For sure.
And so as part of EOR, we have been handling and storing for 50 years up to 20 million metric tons a year.
Wow.
We have over 6,000 CO2 injector wells in the subsurface out there in the Permian. We have access to about 2,500 miles of pipelines. Mm-hmm. So that's about the distance between New York City to Los Angeles. Wow. Is about the pipeline sizes that we have.
Amazing.
We have 13 gas processing plants that practice pretty much every CO2 separation and capture technology out there. We have like 10 amine processing trains. We have membranes out the wazoo, so to speak. We got cryogenic systems that all separating CO2 from natural gas and other, you know, nitrogen and other things like that. So, you know, we have this legacy that we can build upon as part of being a carbon management company. And we do things at scale. I mean, we have almost 1 million horsepower of compression out in West Texas at our gas processing plants. So think about that. That's a lot of horsepower,
Yep.
right? So we know these things. We know practically what to go do. We know how to manage the cost to do all those things. We also have an engineering and major project team that has the systems and discipline to handle billion-dollar projects, bring them in on time and on budget.
Yep.
And so when you think about climate as being big, the oil and gas industry knows how to do things big.
Exactly.
And that's why it would be good to have them part of the solution. And that's what Oxy is taking a leadership role on being part of that solution. You know, in our case, we have OxyChem, that organization, and I was involved with them for 30 years. Take test tube innovations, have the systems and processes and to de-risk it so you can build a commercial scale facility and actually make the chemicals and make them commercially successful. Mm-hmm. So all this expertise places us in a unique position to provide solutions that remove carbon emissions on an industrial scale. Mm-hmm. Our strategy is designed to create value for our existing businesses while at the same time helping to accelerate the path to net zero, not only for ourselves, but other organizations looking to do the same. Mm-hmm. So when you look at direct air capture, you know, pivoting to that, you know, we're working to provide multiple solutions that can help Oxy and others reduce emissions. So we can capture and store atmospheric CO2 permanently deep underground. Mm-hmm. And we can provide hard to decarbonize industries like aviation or marine with what I talked to you about earlier about carbon dioxide removals, or CDRs, and those are credits. Those are removals. Those are not reductions. Those are removals. And they can address their emissions and get to net zero. So, and DAC, direct air capture, and DAC is a terrible name, right? You'd think that you'd come up with a nice word, but direct air capture, it's stuck. It's DAC, right? So DAC, it can enable so much. When you talk about a hydrogen economy, hydrogen's hard. It's so small. It can be hazardous and dangerous. It can brittle pipelines and all those sort of things. But if you combine it with CO2 from the atmosphere, you can make a drop-in fuel. You can make natural gas. That's not natural. Exactly. It's e-gas, for example. Yeah. So you can make use of the entire infrastructure that's in the United States and the world to handle fossil fuels, except now put a CO2 from the atmosphere combined with a hydrogen. Oh. Let's say you're up in New England and you have terrible subsurface underneath your feet. You can't sequester CO2. Yet you have a plant that you built 10 years ago before climate really became relevant to you, and now you are trying to export materials over to European Union. And European Union has put up border adjustment mechanisms, basically a tax, to protect their local industry. How are you going to compete? Exactly. Yeah. So you can't put in a 250 or 500 mile pipeline. You could cost you like $500 million just for the pipeline, and to pay for it, it's tens if not hundreds of dollars per metric ton of CO2 to pay that off from the bankers. So you can use CDRs to apply it to your product that's going over to Europe, for example, in order to meet your climate obligations. And then it allows you to take your relatively 10-year-old plant to run it, say, for 20 years. You can depreciate the fixed investment there, pay off your bills, and then you can, when new technology comes in, you can substitute that for the technology you've been doing. So it allows these communities, instead of like losing a major employer where they uproot and go down south to Houston that has great subsurface underneath their feet. Exactly. Now they get to keep their plant and their livelihood up there in say, New England, as an example. Other things like it complements point source. And, we mentioned point source capture and hubs and things like that. But in real life, you don't capture 100% of the CO2 from a point source. Of course. You have reliability. There's always slip on the amine system. So maybe you can get 95%, 90%. Still very good. It's still great. Yeah. But it's hard to say you're net zero. Yeah. So what CDRs can do is you can buy those CDRs and apply it to your point source capture project, making it net zero. Wow. Now, it's going to cost you more money, and so it forces and it drives behaviors of the point source plant, and that they have to get the reliability up because it costs them this premium amount of money to make them net zero. So if they run great, they'd buy a little bit of CDRs. Yeah. If they run terrible, they can still be net zero because they can buy CDRs. And all that is tied to, it's sort of like a spot market in the CDR world, at least in theory. And if you look at these storage hubs, for example, you have point source that's go over, and so when you try to do a project, you got to talk to the person who's generating the CO2. You got to figure out who's going to put the pipeline in, and you got to do the subsurface and characterization, all that type of stuff. That whole project's a lot of money because you got capture, you got transportation, and then you have the storage side of that. So if you look at that storage, what a DAC can do is be an anchor tenant at these hubs. So the DAC sits right on top of the great subsurface. It puts in the subsurface wells and characterize all that, so they can be an anchor tenant. So then people can then bring in their point source and deliver the CO2. So it sort of breaks that chicken or the egg cycle. Exactly. And that's another thing that DAC can do. So we talked about EOR earlier, enhanced oil recovery, that uses CO2 to tease out oil out of a reservoir. So in general, if you look at a barrel of oil, 1 barrel of oil is about a half a metric ton of CO2. So, and that's about what, when you do an EOR, now there's always caveats to that. Sometimes you use more CO2, sometimes it's less CO2, but on average it's about 0.5 metric tons of CO2 per barrel of oil you produce in an EOR operation. So if you took that CO2 that was from the atmosphere, you can make a net zero barrel of oil out of that process because you've taken the CO2 emissions that you pulled from the atmosphere, put it in the EOR operation, make a barrel of oil that now is net zero because you've mitigated all the CO2. So from a harm perspective, if you focus not so much on fossil fuels, but instead focus on the emissions and abating and addressing the emissions from the use of fossil fuels, I think that's the right approach because then you can make something that is relatively lower cost than a lot of the options. It's not free, but it's lower cost than a lot of options. And it basically meets all the climate requirements from a net zero perspective. So just wanted to mention that to you also.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And I really like the point that you mentioned about like who's better than the oil and gas industry to tackle all of these topics, especially that we already have like the resources. For example, Oxy has the pipelines that they are using for EOR, but now like they are going to be using them for carbon sequestration purposes. We also have like the skill sets because subsurface and also surface. So this makes all the sense for the oil and gas industry to be one of the main contributors to reducing emissions. You previously talked about some of the challenges regarding carbon capture and storage and direct air capture, which is mainly costs. But of course, there are other challenges that can be, of course, like economic viability, policy frameworks, regulatory compliance, and logistical concerns. So, and in addition to that, we also have the idea of the public acceptance. So it's also another thing that we need to focus on when we are initiating all of these carbon capture and storage projects. So could you please tell us how do you envision overcoming these challenges and obstacles in order to make carbon capture and storage and direct air capture a feasible and effective strategy for the future?
That's a good question. When I look at putting in any commercial project, I mean, my roots are in OxyChem, and at every one of our chemical plants, we have a community advisory panel. We interact with the local people because we operate with the permission of the local community. So, and we're taking that same philosophy. So like the director of capture plants in South Texas Hub, for example, is going to be down near Kingsville, near Corpus Christi. We've been engaging for a year and a half, the local mayor, the local county judge, and all the people there that have an opinion on how this needs to be done. I think universally, they like the idea of jobs. It's a pretty distressed community there. They like the idea of doing good for the climate and their children, because it's all true. That's what we're trying to accomplish. So when we commercialized Carbon Engineering's direct air capture technology, we chose that technology on purpose because we felt it was scalable and that we could bring it at a global scale. And there's synergies with what we do today. For example, potassium hydroxide is the capture agent to react with the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Potassium hydroxide, OxyChem is one of the largest producers of that material in the world. In fact, I spent a lot of my career at OxyChem trying to stop CO2 from reacting with the potassium hydroxide that ended up to be an impurity. Now it's because it's so reactive to CO2.
Wow.
And so that's, as an example, and other synergies in the big innovation that Carbon Engineering really has. They have many of them, but in their contacting this solution with the air, they have some secret sauce in terms of doing it very energy efficiently. The capture flux is phenomenal. Well, they use a polyvinyl chloride fill, which is like a cooling tower fill, except we've tweaked it a little bit in a certain way. And OxyChem is one of the largest producers of PVC in the world.
Wow.
And we have a research center up near Cleveland called Avon Lake Technical Center that actually has an R&D center that modifies PVC resins in a certain way to make them more useful in the application. As an example, we make a PVC resin that's really good for CPVC. We make a PVC resin, completely different recipe, that goes into medical tubing and medical bags, all for specific customers that we've teamed with these customers to make a resin that really performs well in their operation. Wow. Same sort of thing we can do and are doing with Carbon Engineering technology. The other thing about Carbon Engineering technology is that a lot of the supply chains exist in that, from a DAC perspective. So a cooling tower is an air contactor. So we can use that same supply chain and innovate on the guts of it. So it's like as a chemical engineer, or you're a petroleum engineer, but you've heard of process intensification.
Yeah.
So process intensification is a way of taking existing supply chains or existing widgets or existing unit operation and operating them differently to do something different. And that's what carbon engineering technology is. It takes existing supply chains and using them in a different way and assembling them in a different way to make direct air capture economic and useful for society.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a policy framework and regulatory compliance and logistic concerns, everybody wants to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we see, is you want to do the right thing. And as long as you understand what the people's motivations are, you can get them to the right answer to help us move. Or they give us a different, here's the concern. Well, then we go pivot. We go decide how we want to go do things. The regulatory framework, the policy framework around 45Q in the IRA that President Biden signed at $180 a ton for sequestration for direct air capture, that enables us to move faster.
Exactly.
And it's great. It's a great policy. Regulatory compliance, regulatory reform is always important. You got to do the right thing. There's so many regulations that are out there that overlap, that are contradictory. So how do we navigate all that? And that's what we're working hard to go do. And logistical concerns. We have down in South Texas at the South Texas DAC Hub, where we're on King Ranch, which is a large piece of property down there. We've penciled out, say, 30 DAC plants that could fit in that facility. 31 million metric ton per year plants. Plenty of subsurface to accept that CO2. And what are working on are partnering with suppliers of equipment, and they can then use the Port of Corpus Christi to build facilities there, bring in raw materials. And so instead of us making PVC in Houston, shipping it up to, say, New Jersey, and they compound it, and it goes down to Texas, and then it goes down to South Texas. There's a lot of wasted energy with regard to, and carbon emissions, moving materials around. So if you put what we call a dactory right at the point that you're going to be building all these facilities, you have additional jobs, you have additional infrastructure, reduced to carbon intensity, you can innovate right there, almost immediate results back on how things are performing. So that's sort of the vision that we're putting together. And then as part of that direct air capture, we're going to have clean electrons, we're going to have CO2 from the atmosphere. And one thing, when you talk a lot about carbon capture and storage, but I look at carbon capture utilization and storage. So we've partnered with a lot of CO2 utilization companies that convert that CO2 into useful products for today. And so they may be a tenant on a clean campus to pull and make use of those shared resources and that infrastructure we're putting in. And that's why we're partnering with many different utilization companies that we feel share our vision, our culture, and are really doing some pretty cool things.
Okay, great. I have here a question. There are now the majority of oil and gas companies, they have created a new low carbon segment in their companies. And now this means that all of these companies are going to enter this business, so it makes it more competitive. But at the same time, not all of these companies are like Oxy, for example, has a history of sequestering the CO2, which means that there might be future risks in case one of these companies got approval for a class experiment to inject the CO2. So don't you think companies with maybe low experience in such kind of business might, in a way or another, ruin the business by, for example, especially that we are tackling with CO2. It's not like producing oil, because there are a lot of risk with CO2. So don't you think that this might, in a way or another, impact the industry, especially now we are still at the beginning of carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue with other oil and gas majors that they know how to drill a well, they knew how to do the cement, they knew how to and monitor all that. It's the mom and pops coming out of somebody's garage making promises and then putting a rig in. Yeah, that would be bad. Yeah. And but I won't say it's the Wild West, but that's the role of regulations, right? Is that you got to make sure that people know what they're doing and they go do what they want to go do. And that would be bad if somebody did that. And there are a lot of promises out there. I mean, there's a lot of people that advertise, put up a website. Suddenly they're experts. They get a former oil and gas person doing it. But you have to look at when you drill these wells, it's sort of like, do you have a balance sheet, right? So oil and gas majors have a balance sheet, and they can guarantee they're not going to screw up and put a lousy well in that's going to cause leaking and give the industry a bad eye. A mom and pop, I won't say, or somebody that doesn't have that balance sheet and they're just drilling a well on their own personal funds, and the liability and the risk associated with that. Shame on whoever's a corporate person that's giving them the CO2. That's not going. We're not seeing that happening. I think there's a lot of noise, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I just wanted to ask because I always think about this question in my head. All right, now let's talk about Oxy, which is the focus of our podcast, and specifically Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. I know that you have a previous long history with OxyChem. That's why. And to be honest, this is the first time I know that Oxy is so big in the chemical industry as well. So this is pretty cool. And which is also supporting the low carbon business. So this is great. In our exploration of Oxy's specific position within the low carbon sector, could you please discuss how Oxy Low Carbon Ventures leads the development and implementation of pioneering carbon management solution, including carbon capture and storage technologies? If you want to, for example, talk about one of the publicly announced projects that Oxy has related to carbon capture and storage.
Okay, be glad to. I'll take a stab at it, and feel free to ask me another question if I get off track too far. Oxy was the first U.S. oil and gas company to establish goals for a net zero emission that aligned with the Paris Agreement. So we led the way. And we're positioning ourselves to be really the carbon management company that we feel our legacy with regard to oil and gas, CO2, EOR, OxyChem, midstream, and this allows us so much knowledge that we can take our history. So we can manage the life cycle of carbon in really a unique way, just compared to our competitors. And when we talk about CCS, we also want to talk about CCUS. So, use is the utilization. And I mentioned before, if you couple that CO2 from the atmosphere and make a sustainable product, like if you wanted to make a fuel out of CO2 using a hydrogen economy like we talked earlier, it's a short-lived sequestration, but it sets up a virtuous cycle of circular carbon energy cycle that allows no net harm to the climate. But using those feedstocks to make, as I said, fuels, but plastics, clothing, concrete, and other useful products that we use today, but those things today are derived from fossil fuels, it will help generate a more sustainable world. So when we look at low carbon ventures, we've focused on and have invested in companies that do all those things. Okay, so as our view towards a sustainable circular economy and in the future. So for low carbon ventures, we're focused specifically on technologies and project development that fits our expertise and core competence. So we're focused on technologies that are ready for industrial scale and deployment. That's mostly true, although we fund from technology equity investments from seed all the way to, say, Series G. And if you look at three of our companies, Carbon Engineering, we ended up buying at $1.1 billion was what was publicized. And two of our investments, Lonza and Net Power, are actually public. They went an IPO route. So we go from very early on to very mature companies. And our goal is to pull the future to today. So we deploy our knowledge, deploy our resources to help fill the gaps into these different technologies that, because a lot of them are R&D type people, PhD type people, and they don't have the practical experience and the long-term know-how of how to maintain pieces of equipment out in the field. What's the best unit operation to do what they want to accomplish? So that's, as an example of what we do. From our direct air capture plans, we feel it's critical to meet the Paris Agreement targets. It enables rapid emissions removal and low carbon product development. So that's the direct air capture side of it. From and you may or may not know this, but we're developing sequestration hubs between Texas, like Corpus Christi, all the way to New Orleans. And we got, 6 different spots that we've assembled, subsurface acreage. And I think we're up to equivalent of say, 6 billion tons of CO2 storage capacity in the subsurface in those areas.
Wow.
That's because we made it a commitment to put in direct air capture plants. And we basically said, 100 by 2035 or something like that. And as an example of us not just talking about it, but actually doing it, is we're assembling this subsurface area that then can put direct air capture plants on top of, sequester that CO2 in order to meet our ambition.
Wow.
As an example. And again, each one of those are going to be a DAC hub that's going to have, low emissions electrons. It's going to set up an ecosystem of innovation at all these different clean campuses. And if you look at the subsurface, under our feet today, Qasim, it's basically the Saudi Arabia of pore space.
Exactly.
And that's what we've taken advantage of. And there's other, our competitors, our oil and gas comrades, are doing the same sort of thing. I hope they're all successful, because the challenge is so great.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very important. Like when we talk about oil and gas, there are mainly competitions between companies. But when we move to talk about low carbon business, it's mainly about collaborations. Like all of these operators will collaborate in order to reduce their emissions, and CCUS is the solution. All right, sounds great. And now let's talk more about the future of this industry. Could you shed light on the specific trends you foresee playing a pivotal role in shaping the future of low carbon solution in the future? If you want to talk more about like future vision of Oxy when it comes to low carbon management.
Well, it's an interesting question. I can't really tip our hand on too much what our plans are. I think we'll continue down the path. One quote that I like from David Allen, who was an American author and a productivity consultant: we can do anything, but not everything. Yeah. And so Oxy has chosen the very specific areas. We don't play in hydrogen, right? So Oxy Chem, we produce almost 100,000 metric tons a year of hydrogen. Yeah. And we know how to handle hydrogen. We know how to manage cell rooms. We've been doing it since 1906. I mean, that's in our pedigree. And we're not playing in hydrogen because it would be too dilutive of our focus on managing CO2, doing teralithium, doing our carbon utilization, all those different things, reducing the carbon emissions in our plants, reducing scope 1 and scope 2 in what we're doing there. So I guess that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. Sounds good. We tackled before this topic, which is the collaboration between companies, and also like it's quite important to have like a collaboration between the private sector and the government. So how do you think these alliances can accelerate the development and the deployment of sustainable energy solutions?
So the United States has taken a leadership approach to provide incentives through that Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, for development of climate solutions. This policy really helps us accelerate our direct air capture plans. We expect the 45Q tax credit for carbon storage to jumpstart the voluntary market for thousands of leading businesses that have established net zero goals, which can be achieved by carbon dioxide removals or CDRs enabled by direct air capture. Our view is that if you want to solve the atmospheric CO2 issue, then you have to need a commercial market to create scale. For sure. And we believe that practical and good policy applies to create the commerciality in the long term. So direct air capture then becomes self-sustaining. So the need for direct air capture as a carbon removal solution is clear, and certainly incentives help us get there. We just did we were selected for the South Texas DAC Hub, was selected for a DOE grant from the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OSED, since we like acronyms. But so OSED will support this our 1.5 development company, which is Oxy, and through this DAC Hub, through advancement through detailed design and environmental permitting and procurement of long lead time equipment. So in general, because of us being selected by the DOE for this DAC Hub, we think it validates our readiness, our technical maturity, our ability to execute large projects and managing carbon. So we do feel that that this collaboration between us and the DOE, for example, helps us move this technology forward so it can reach its full potential.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great news. All right, since we are talking about the future, what do you think the carbon capture and storage business will look like, let's say in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years from now? What would be the incentives? What would be the technologies? And what would be some of the potential uncertainties or risks that we might face?
All good questions. I think the incentives are going to be for a little while. I don't think that until we figure out how to place a price on the environmental impact of the use of fossil fuels, we're going to continue to require government policy to help us transition into something that's less carbon intensive. Mm-hmm. From a technology perspective, economics are going to be the main driver. Policy can drive activity, but economics will decide who the winners are and who the losers are. Yeah. In the short and medium term, I see that we'll focus electrifying everything that we can, whatever makes sense. There's a lot of industrial processes that still require heat and energy, and so that's going to and there's a lot of capital that's tied up with that, and you need to appreciate that capital. So there's going to be a time here for the energy transition. I see direct air capture will continue to grow and costs will come down. I'm excited about what we're doing here at Oxy to drive costs down. As the technology guy, I see 3 or 4 waves of technology innovations that are in the drawing boards right now. We're piloting some of that stuff, and we're really excited about what the future holds. Wow. And point source capture makes sense where it makes sense. And I mentioned you can capture it, and thermodynamically that's preferred over direct air capture just because it's more concentrated in CO2. Mm-hmm. But if you're sitting on top of a piece of granite, you got to move the CO2 somewhere, so you got to put in the price of a pipeline and then the capture side of it. And depending on the cost of that pipeline, direct air capture actually may be cheaper. Yeah. And by mid-century, 50 years from now, I see low-cost energy, renewables, but maybe even we'll have nuclear fusion going on. Mm-hmm. And that's all going to power society and growth and direct air capture. And because at the end of the day, I think by mid-century, we'll have solved our climate crisis. We'll have CO2 under control. Great news. And then we're going to be asking each other, okay. Now
what's the next challenge?
Well, the next challenge is, what climate do we want? Exactly. Do we want to go back to 275? Do we want to go to 350? Because there's winners and losers throughout the world depending on how you dial into CO2. For sure. So that's going to be a challenge for the next generation of people.
Oh, I couldn't agree more on this. All right. One of the last 2 questions here. Since we were talking about many companies now getting into the business of low carbon solutions, so what piece of advice would you extend to your fellow industry leaders and policymakers who are considering and are responsible for CCS technologies? Any kind of advice?
Well, I always like to say the enemy of the good is the perfect. Mm-hmm. So if you wait for the perfect solution, it then generates the perfect answer. You only learn by doing.
Yes.
So, you're getting your PhD, I have a PhD, and the first time I envision an experiment never works out the way I thought it was going to be. You have to pivot, you have to adjust, you have to learn by doing. And so taking some of your budget and learning by doing is the only way you'll be able to come up with a good solution to address climate. So that's my quote. I will finish, and I always like to finish with a quote that I use from Mark Twain. So Mark Twain, the humorist, author, American author, he said, "Go forth and do great things." Right. So I would challenge you, and I would challenge the people listening to this podcast, what great thing are you going to go work on?
Exactly. Hopefully we will reach that. All right. I think with that, we come to an end to our podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Zeller, for your time and for this insightful discussion. I really enjoyed every part of it, and I learned a lot, especially about Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. On behalf of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, I would like to thank you for your invaluable collaboration on making this podcast happen, and for your time and great insights, and also for hosting us here in Oxy. I wish you every success in your career and your endeavors to come. Thank you again.
Thank you.